The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
There's a radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, question. Is it tete-a-tete or tete-a-tete?
I say tete-a-tete.
I thought it was tete-a-tete.
No, it's just 2 tetes, I think.
Or is it te-a-te?
Tete.
Tete.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a tete-a-tete. Tēnā koutou katoa, welcome to Gone by Lunchtime. We're coming to you live from Te Puke. Either today or yesterday or at some unannounced moment in the future.
The sun is shining. I'm in a bath of kiwi fruit. There is no place in the world I would rather be.
Speak for yourselves. I'm like really grappling with the cost of holidaying crisis. I have to stay in Auckland.
I'm joking, obviously. We're actually in Vladivostok because we've not been banned. Annabelle and Ben, Annabelle Lee Mather and Ben Thomas, neither of them have managed to make the coveted list of 32 random people that the Russian government has. Do you think the Russian embassy in Wellington was basically had like 5 minutes to Google 32 people?
I literally think they just did like a
Russia
Twitter
outrage.
search for like NZ plus Russia.
Hashtag NZ poll Russia, do you reckon?
Zelensky is cool, hashtag.
Yeah.
Banned.
Mayor of Dunedin, Aaron Hawkins, found himself on the blacklist, which might put him offside with the Green Left.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that. No disrespect to the Green Left. We'll get to that. We're going to talk about cost of living stuff and maybe a bit about political donations. We're going to absolutely motor through this podcast. Thanks to Jane Yee, the czar of all podcasts, who's just handed me a note which says, mention Annabelle wearing a mask. She's a bit muffled. Could you give us a sample there, Annabelle, of their muffledness?
Can I just say about this mask? Remember like a few pods back and Ben was trying to roast me about my mask, which was like quite a pretty one while he wore his mask in his hand.
I believe it happened.
And he said, I need a better mask. Now I've got the better mask.
Yep.
I literally feel like I'm like dying in my own carbon emissions.
It's so effective that it actually restricts all air, all noise. Yeah. and Jane has given me this note, I think, because Tiahi is doing something else at the moment, very important. And so she's fitting in, and she doesn't want to have to for people to go, Teha to come back and go, oh yeah, no, you didn't, you sort of didn't quite get the...
We'll get slammed on Twitter for like mixing down the wahine toa.
They do that to me all
white men
time.
Putting your lower in the mix.
You've put your Carly Rae T-shirt around her microphone or something. To classic japes in the GBL pod. Look, Ben.
Yeah.
You were in the newspaper recently.
I was.
It's listed as a popular pundit. Did you see that,
Annabelle? I did. And I'm like, why are we the last to know?
Finally, some truth from the mainstream media.
It said popular pundit on the Spin-off's
Gone by lunchtime pod.
No, I don't know if it did. I think it said
well known. And I was like,
okay.
Oh my God.
But well known is kind of neutral, isn't it? For whereas popular. They didn't say on the popular. He's popular.
We're well known.
I felt like we're being attacked.
Oh, see, I was like, I didn't even know people knew about us. This is very excitables.
We're huge in Wellington.
Love you,
I was down in
Wellington.
Wellington the other week for longer than I had expected because of their inclement weather, which trapped us all like refugees there. And gone by lunchtime, massive.
Tell us what that story was about. Ben, what's going on? You're joining the massive pundits super corporation. Is that what it is? It's like a whole lot of people who love talking about politics on television and radio, but need to pay for it somehow.
Pretty much.
Is that what it is?
I've joined a firm called Capital GR, which was started by a guy called Neil Jones, who was a former chief of staff of the Labour Party, and includes Hayden Munro. There's another director there. He was, of course, Labour's award-winning campaign manager in its 2020 election rout of pretty much everyone else and New Zealand democracy.
Yes.
They're both also enthusiastic blowhards like me who like to have their opinions heard. That's separate from the business, which is sort of,
Is Clint in that group too?
Clint works there as well. Yeah. So it's what did they say in the newspaper? We're expanding the firm up to Auckland and trying to cover a broader swathe of the political spectrum. It is important to note that punditry, whether I'm doing it, whether Neil Jones is doing it, whatever, that's just a personal hobby. That's nothing to do with business. So, but because of course, I've always taken conflicts of interest very seriously. My personal policy is I don't talk about clients. I think Neil's the same. If something comes up where there is a conflict of interest of any sort that we're talking about unavoidably, I'll either say that, I'll say I've got clients in this area, bear that in mind, or I'll dive out the nearest window to avoid commenting.
Or it will be defenestrated by Annabelle and Toby.
I have been meaning to talk about whether we could move the podcast studio onto the ground floor of the spin-off. We're quite high up here. It's it's a historic building, so it's got quite high ceilings. And so even though technically we're only up one flight of stairs, it's quite a long way.
It adds a certain element of danger, I think, to the podcast. Okay, well, it's good to know, and it's important that listeners understand that Ben doesn't talk on matters where
Ben is as compromised as he's always been.
He's compromised in a range of different ways, but when it comes to clients, he will let us know in advance. We don't talk about it, or he brings it up along the way. Annabelle is dying.
Sorry.
The other thing, let's sticking with Ben.
Yeah.
You the other day, Annabelle, unearthed a box of, I think the technical term is old stuff, and there was a flyer for a Ben Thomas campaign to be international officer at AUSA.
Officer for International Affairs, was it?
It was quite a piece of political communications, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was his early work and always the most valuable.
And I think if I'm describing this right, I don't have it in front of me, but it is seared very much into my brain. It has a picture of a young Ben with a globe, and he has his hand on the globe, much like a Charles Atlas or a Saudi or Trump on the golden orb. Oh, there it is. It says "nya ha 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 ha" at the top. Tell us about it. Oh, then it says at the bottom. What does it say at the bottom, Annabelle?
It says, vote Ben Thomas, International Affairs Officer, 1998, because it's a small world after all.
That's a visual pun. So I think that was my first ever political campaign that I was involved in on behalf of myself. Still the second least successful that I've ever been involved in after ACT 2017's national effort.
How did that go?
I didn't win.
Really?
Yeah, no, I didn't know. I won some elections later. I became the editor of Kraken. I was the media officer, whatever that is.
Was that is that after Bomber you became the editor of Kraken?
That was sometime after Bomber. That was a number of years after Bomber. But I don't know. My greater political success also coincided with not having a sort of kind of half mohawk kind of haircut, like sort of. I would shave the sides and then sort of it was kind of like a very flat raccoon-like mohawk. Yeah.
And is that...
it was very cool at the time, I feel like.
You've got hair.
Has that informed your political
before.
advice since?
Very cool.
I mean, is haircuts a big part of the advice that you routinely dispatch to your clients?
Look, I mean, look, you know, if you see how well Christopher Luxon has done since he shaved off his mohawk.
Yes.
Then...
But that wasn't advice so much as inspiration, was it? Hey, speaking of AUSA, which is often so sort of very democratic, it elects everything, including media officers, international officers, editors, often to its own detriment. Brings me to the Green Party, which is extremely democratic and sometimes some may say to its own detriment, but it's fantastic that it's very involved and people are very involved. And one result of that was the weekend before last, I think, if I'm right. We're talking now, I should say this, in terms of getting the housekeeping done. We're speaking on Wednesday, the 3rd of August, shortly before 10 a.m. James Shaw, this morning, is going to appear in a car park in Ohiro Bay in Wellington, where he's going to announce the National Adaptation Plan. But last weekend before last, he was having a bit of difficulty with his own membership. There was an AGM that was held. It was virtual. Because of COVID, they decided not to do the IRL version in Christchurch. It's a very, 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 very pared-back affair, certainly as far as the public-facing part was concerned. They weren't even doing speeches. And then a press release arrived on Saturday afternoon, I think, and the news was that James Shaw was being asked, in effect, to reapply for his own job. That is to say that more than 25% of delegates, specifically 32 of 107 voting delegates, had said, we want to reopen nominations.
For the non or not necessarily woman co-leader.
That's right. They changed the rules a few months back, which meant it used to be one male, one female. Now they've got one female and the other one...
and not necessarily female.
But also they need to have a Māori leader as well.
A Māori leader, not a female anymore.
No, but they do need to have a Māori leader, but Marama Jack Davidson is at least one of those.
Yes, and one of the reasons that's important in terms of some of the coverage, there were various theories that were floating around that there was some plot that meant that this was opening the way for Chloe Swarbrick to become co-leader, which she ruled herself out, as is the entire caucus now. And so we have a situation with James Shaw's opponent again is Ron, i.e. Reopen nominations, and he will again go up against, I'm pretty sure they've closed now nominations, so it doesn't mean he's out of the woods. Like it could still be that more than 25% of delegates say reopen nominations, which would mean in effect that he would have to resign, I think, from that position. This is, Annabelle, one of those, the way this is played is it's kind of one of those perennial issues in politics and party politics, not just in the Green Party, but perhaps more pronounced in the Green Party than in many other parties, which is the tension between the purist, radical side of a party and the more pragmatic or moderate. These are all useful to some extent only terms. Is that how you see it? Is James Shaw an example of someone who is being punished for being too pragmatic?
Well, I actually don't think he is. I think he's being punished for creating the perception that he has abandoned the Greens' true kaupapa. I think that this is an opinion poll on his emissions reduction scheme and a vote of no confidence in it. And you can understand why, because any scheme that doesn't include the dairy herd in agriculture is frankly ludicrous, and you don't have to be a hardcore lefty full-on Green to know that. That's just practical common sense. They're the largest emitters in the country. I think that for the more left-hand side of the party, though, that the Greens have always been committed to addressing climate change, but in a just manner, not a manner that that punishes Indigenous people. And so I think when he tried to essentially punish Māori for having pine trees on the last vestiges of their land instead of native trees, that would have got him offside with some of the party as well. So I think that this isn't necessarily a war between, the far left of the party and the more pragmatic. I mean, what's pragmatic to me seems, I think most people would agree, is addressing our dairy problem, and the scheme doesn't do that. So I think it's a call by the party for him to take their concerns a bit more seriously and to do the mahi that he's been put there to do.
I guess the question on the mahi, Ben, in part, is what more could or might he have done? In some ways, the criticisms he said that what I need to take from this is to be listening better to the party, and he's acknowledged that. But the reality is that we have a majority Labour government, and they have a cooperation agreement, which many in the Green Party, I think this can be you can join dots between what happened at that AGM and that cooperation agreement, where it was, would the Greens have been better, is part of the question, isn't it? Simply to remain in opposition / crossbenchers, and rather than this sort of slightly ungainly 1 foot in, 1 foot out arrangement.
And it really depends on what your metric of better is. If it means feeling better about yourself as a person and your moral purity and your own ethical status, sure, yep. That it would probably be better to stay outside and just throw stones and say not enough is being done and organise protests and march with school climate strikers or whatever. Absolutely. In terms of, do you get better results in terms of inching towards that ultimate goal of, zero carbon emissions in New Zealand by having James Shaw there? Of course. I mean, he's much better qualified for that job than any of his Labour counterparts. Jacinda Ardern was pretty quick coming out saying that he would maintain that role even if he was no longer the Greens co-leader. Now, whether it was tactically sound rather of her or not, that was simply the truth. He is the best qualified Labour and quite probably national Minister for Climate Change. He understands business, but he is very committed to, the kaupapa. The issue was pretty well crystallised, I think, by Nandor Tangsos, who was, not only a very, very principled MP for the Greens in the early 2000s, but also a very effective one, working on select committees, but somebody who really struggled being inside Parliament. And, he, infamously kind of threw away his wristwatch when he resigned from Parliament and said, I won't need this anymore.
Didn't he smash it with a hammer?
Yeah, I think so. And he came out and said, look, we've got to make a distinction between the people who are in Parliament and the people who are outside. Now, Nandor ultimately came down on the side of him personally wanting to be outside Parliament, but clearly still recognising that you need those people inside Parliament as well, being propelled along by the more radical fringes. But honestly, you don't get anywhere by being outside and throwing stones. There is more of a perception. I in terms of, is it a left, centre, whatever, pragmatist sort of factional battle? I think the perception is that James Shaw is not as concerned with social justice issues. There seems to be this sort of idea that you could almost hive off James Shaw as a sort of Labour subsidiary dealing with kind of fringe issues like climate change, while the rest of the caucus concentrates on core green environmentalist business like progressive gender politics, higher benefits, things like that. Now, those may or may not be very worthy causes, but they're not strictly speaking environmental issues. And I think it was Luke Malpass at Stuff wrote that, the Greens benefit from a sort of an accident of historical branding where they are essentially a far left parliamentary party with an environmental brand name.
I think that I have a different view on, what you're able to achieve in government versus what you can achieve in opposition. And I think that history shows that the road to hell is paved with coalition deals. and when parties forget what their raison d'etre or move away from their raison d'etre, they're punished for it by voters. And, United Future, to be honest, what was their raison d'etre? Who knows? But New Zealand First and the Māori Party. So I think that probably their grassroots members are probably acutely aware of that, and that his emission scheme does look like policy drift. When you cannot even say cows are the problem, that's a problem. But I also think that we shouldn't undervalue the power of opposition. And if you look back at the Greens' track record, particularly under Matidia and Russell Norman, they were able to achieve all sorts of amazing things from opposition. So I think there's a fine line between wanting to be in government and all of the resource that comes along with that and the influence, but also not losing your kaupapa or the aspirations of your kaupapa. I think that's a big part of it. The thing that I think is interesting now is that 25% of the party say that, they're not happy with him. I've heard some people railing like, 25%, that's not democracy. Yes, it is. It's their constitution. Constitutions are part of democracy. If 25% are, vote that way, that's what can happen. But now that all of the MPs have ruled out running, what message does that send to their grassroots membership? Like, you're not happy, but we don't care? I think that, probably there should have been a bit more strategising with the people that put up that vote about ensuring that they had a candidate ready to roll. But also it doesn't seem like the MPs in Parliament have really heeded that call or taken it very seriously. I've not seen anyone, come out and say, look, we understand, but we don't feel the time is right, or, we've got to get through this. Like, none of that's happened publicly that I've seen. And so, it just makes you wonder about is there a disconnect between the parliamentary branch of the Greens and the rest of the party, or what's going on?
Tiano Tionoa and Elizabeth Kerekere have both, and Chloe Swarbrick to some degree have all said we need to listen to the members better. And I wonder whether by, the fact that Tiano Tionoa did not rule out, said I'm thinking about it, suggests to me that he may be thinking about it again whether it's next year or after the election. The fact of the lack of it being a coup, there's been various amount of commentary around that. It is interesting. It's this. There's a coup underway, but you can't really have the old maxim that he who wields the knife shall not wear the crown. Well, no one wanted the crown, and there were a whole bunch of different knives. And in a sense, that suggests that it is a real thing. It might be a group of Young Greens and a group of the Green Left Network combined, but they were sending a message, and you could make the argument that that's actually the system working reasonably well. Until such point, of course, as they crater in the polls, if that were to happen. I thought, Ben, the other interesting thing was that Kevin Haig was on the Detail podcast, and he was speaking in defence of James Shaw, and he said one of the reasons he decided to talk about it was that James Shaw had defeated him in the leadership campaign. And his read on the message that was being sent was that James Shaw was judged by the membership to be more electable in the broader sense, and that it was a sort of irony that now he was in effect being punished for being able to reach out to a wider voter base. And
this is a really important point, which is that the Greens, who are now polling around sort of 10% and have been steadily, their activist base and their membership is actually a very, very small part of that. And the Greens, have said it a number of times. I think they've said publicly, their vote stays high when they're not in conflict with Labour. So this idea that by sort of more strongly differentiating themselves, by calling Labour, soft on the environment and by whacking Labour all the time, over 20 years in Parliament, that has not worked for the Greens. in a polling sense. It actually is the sort of thing that brings them close to basically electoral annihilation.
But then we come back to that.
I don't think you can attribute that 10% to James Shaw's leadership. I think that 10% is accumulated support over decades of demonstrating that they're a party that kind of has their shit together, that they're not flaky, that they're reliable. And actually, it's probably more the Chloe Swarbricks of the world that are bringing in vote. And let's remember, she's the only one with an actual seat rather than necessarily the pragmatism of Shaw.
That's absolutely true. But remember that the Green Left dislike Chloe Swarbrick as well.
Some of them do. She's not a member of that particular group.
No. And when their ratings came out at the last election, they had her well down. So and I don't think anyone would argue that she's not principled and that she's not out there to achieve things, or that she's just sort of trying to mollycoddle the middle classes. But there's no sort of. There's no easy answers for the Greens here, but in terms of, saying they're a party that's got their shit together, well, the last week or two suggests that maybe they don't, in terms of the voters there get them to 10%. Obviously they do better when
I actually don't think it. Like, it's interesting for us because we're into politics and all of that shit. I actually don't think it's a big deal in the wider scheme of things. Like, it's a little bit of argy-bargy. It's not like not like National and all their leadership dramas. In fact, in some ways, you could argue it's a sign of a healthy party.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll find out more about that. I'm reminded of something I learned from reading Gareth Hughes' book about Jeanette Fitzsimons, which was that there was a remit I think it was the early days of the Green Party rather than the Values Party that preceded it. Values Party, of course, founded 50 years ago this year. But there was a remit at one point that, and when they were discussing the leadership, because of course at one point there were no leaders in the Values Party, it was a leaderless party, but the idea was that in fact everyone should be a leader and every member of the party should be the co-leader. And so you have like several hundred people who are officially the go. So that's just, there's something to consider.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I cordial with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the Pōtiki of the Taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirahama, the Kōpapa Korangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komato Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spin-Off Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's talk about the cost of living payment, which has attracted a fair bit of heat in this week. It was meant to be a great big moment for the Labour government. It was the sort of centrepiece flagship headline announcement of the last budget, wasn't it? That there will be a $350 cost of living payment to what we talked a lot about, the squeezed middle became known as. That is people who weren't, who not for beneficiaries.
No,
but people
they're fine.
Under 70K.
Under 70K, not receiving winter energy payment, I think it was. So that rolled out the start of this week. The IRD were tasked with doling it out, and turns out that it went to quite a few people around the world, including some quite well-to-do people who were saying, "Oh, look at that."
Do you reckon Christopher Luxon got it in Hawaii?
I hope so. I was thinking what they should do with this, just to try and solve another problem, is that if you don't return the money and you accept it, then you are immediately obliged to train as a nurse and then return to New Zealand. It's there in the fine print, and come and help help out. It was meant to be 2.1 million people got it. So far, it's only about 1.4 million. But also this
to make up for the geographical spread is much greater.
Well, it's a global market. Ben,
yeah.
Obviously, the National Party has latched onto this.
Yep.
And we have heard very, very clear talking points, particularly from Christopher Luxon this morning. Rubbish, shambles, no plan, disrespecting taxpayers. Very clear. It's like, I think they were written in vivid on his wrist. But why not? Patrick Smelly was on the radio yesterday on Radio New Zealand saying, Patrick Smelly is not given to hyperbole, said that something like this can be political poison because it's very easy to get your head around. It's seen as attracts that point of fairness, but it also goes to these questions around ability to implement a plan or a policy.
Yeah.
Is it a cock up or is it a beat up?
Well, of course, it's a cock-up. The idea that the government, even over the weekend, the Prime Minister, when Jack Tame was talking about, other government's measures to combat inflation or to help people through inflation.
In an interview with the Prime Minister.
Yeah, create more inflation. And the Prime Minister said no, because the cost of living payment is very targeted. And so, now, of course, it won't create inflation in New Zealand if it's going to London. It might actually help us in the relative tables.
We're creating inflation around the world.
Yeah, in the UK. It's one way to win the league tables, right? But, but it's clearly not targeted. I mean, the reports I've heard of, people getting it, they almost just sort of seem kind of completely arbitrary. They certainly don't seem to have been particularly rigorously cross-checked, according to the data sets. David Parker came up with a figure yesterday and said, it's probably about 1%. 1%.
20,000 that would be, wouldn't it?
But as far as he can tell, there's no basis for thinking that. I mean,
I think he indicated that's some advice he'd had from IRD.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not clear that Inland Revenue know what's going on here either. So, if it's just if everyone who's got like an IRD number and once lived in New Zealand and has a bank account registered with IRD is getting, I mean, I don't know how to, I'm putting in some questions to IRD to try and find this out. But, in terms of, is that all student loan debtors who are overseas? It's 100,000 people.
Or people who've lived here for a while.
They have to supply a bank
Popular
account.
Pundit Annabelle Lee Mather.
Can I just say, in terms of David Parker, if you guys want to read the sickest burns about this issue regarding David Parker, you should read Claire Trevette's opinion piece in the Herald yesterday. It's literally LOL funny, so good. Yes, it is a cock-up, but I mean, I guess that's to be expected when you're turning a piece of policy around so fast and you're entrusting IRD to do it. I kind of think it kind of goes to the crux of the issue that this government has, which is that while it's awesome to give whānau in need more money, it's literally fiddling around the edges. And it is inflation tanga. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I enjoy aromatherapy as much as the next person, and even I know that it's inflationary. But why is it that the government, spending, okay, well, why haven't you sorted out the supermarkets? The plan for it does not go anywhere near far enough. The problem that we have with energy in this country and whānau being charged ridiculous amounts for power, why isn't there stronger regulation? All of those types of things would help to make the cost of living a lot easier in this country without having to dole out money to backpackers in France. So it just seems like such a lost opportunity. The other thing is how about spending that money on wiping out all debt with WINZ? The fact that families get charged for being in emergency accommodation, that they accrue that as a debt, that when they get like a food grant, they have to pay it back is absolutely ridiculous. Why are we not wiping out that debt? That would be a more targeted spend of this money.
And this is the thing, right? You always, since time immemorial, in terms of political spending, you always get, when I was growing up, when I was running for International Affairs Officer at Auckland University, the comparison would be hip operations. It'd be like, how many hip operations could you buy for this waste of government money? Now, if you've sent that payment to 100,000 people who are overseas or aren't entitled to it or whatever, well, that's exactly the same amount of people who are getting the job seeker benefit, who weren't eligible for it, who actually are struggling with inflation, because if you're on the job seeker benefit, by and large, you can't ask for more hours or ask for a pay rise. You're on a fixed income, so you're actually struggling with inflation more than people who are in work, the squeezed middle. So, then those comparisons become inevitable. You say, why, sure, maybe 100,000 people, maybe 5%, maybe that's an okay cost of doing business. But then you look at the opportunity cost, which is you could have paid that same amount to all of the beneficiaries, who don't get it, and who all the poverty groups are fairly rightly up in arms about. So, this is a big problem for the government. One, because it invites questions like that. Two, it just shows more managerial incompetence and more rushed decision making, which this is a result of. And worse, it's quite possible that they overestimated just how grateful people would be for $350.
The only person that's come out of this looking great is Nicola Willis, who is making a powerful case for why she should be the leader of the National Party.
Well, I mean, that turning a positive into a negative perhaps, and it is true that the Andrea Vance's Blue Blood book does end with a mischievous Nicola Willis is waiting in the wings. I don't know if that's...
Are you quoted in there?
What's that?
Are you quoted in
Am
there?
I quoted in the book?
Yes,
I am quoted in the book.
Am I quoted in the book?
I'm assuming you're one of the many insider sources. I just want to say before we move on to Nicola Willis that I'm not a fancy downtown political strategist, but I think maybe one of the reasons you weren't elected international affairs representative on the Auckland University Student Association was talking about hip operations. I don't think that is part of the core kaupapa of international affairs function.
Anyway, I remember I think Model UN was a big issue.
Nicola Willis has done really well, right? Like she is, she's been so good at hammering those. Are you going, Annabelle?
I've got to go, but I love you guys. Have a great rest of the pod.
What about political donations? We're going to talk about. Okay,
yeah, you guys are.
Just full of
she's running. She's
done.
She's heading to a Fido day. She's going to take a flight.
Yeah. Okay. Nominations closed. Auckland Mayor Annabelle Lee Mather. What do you think?
See you, Annabelle.
Bye. Okay. Nicola Willis has been really impressive, and again, I mean, the Luxon Te Puke thing was, I think, a 24-hour wonder, and
it was the sort of thing that it's a funny sideswipe column. Yeah. I don't think it's really a big political scandal.
But okay, we're leaving to one side any attempt to do scuttlebutt on the leadership. It is true that Nicola Willis has performed really well since taking on that portfolio.
Yeah. I don't think anyone, but both as finance spokesperson, but also as deputy leader.
Yeah.
I think Luxon's really allowed her, well, not allowed her, but the two of them are working very well together as a team. And I think that was, actually going back to Andrea's book, Blue Blood, which everyone should read. So, if you're a political tragic,
how many of the
exciting.
Unnamed background comments come from you?
Probably none.
None?
Yeah, I'd say.
None?
And sure. And I wasn't around for that time. No. So, I wasn't an insider in the Bridges Muller columns.
Actually, well, everything was fine. I mean,
which is about.
Can you track the collapse of the party to your departure?
But, well, no, that's not right, because I left in 2014 and they're obviously still polling very strongly. I mean, people.
I know, but that's probably the point at which John Key looked around him and thought, "Is it worth it?"
Yeah. There were a lot of people forget that, Bill English actually won 45% of the vote. He did a great election campaign. And National was still very strong to that point. It totally fell apart afterwards, as the way of these things. But, hopefully for them on the way back up now. But it was a reminder of just how well Key and English work together as a team, and that's something that's really been lacking, in the opposition with the leadership deputy combinations. In opposition, in particular, sometimes you get into this thing where, the deputy is somebody who's basically just waiting their turn for the next schmuck to fall over for them to take their chance, and that was alluded to, The Wilderness, which is a podcast by our friends at Today FM.
Excellent podcast. Yeah.
I actually really like that podcast. People should go and have a listen to it because it's retold through the eyes of the gallery journalists. And it's actually really interesting because in most political sort of memoirs and stuff, like The Ninth Floor.
There are politicians on it too.
A few. But on The Ninth Floor, you had these prime ministers former prime ministers in a very reflective mode, looking back at their lives, thinking about what they could have done differently. And you actually get a bit of that on the, from these former gallery journalists who are now Today FM hosts. Paddy Gower does these sort of mea culpas and it's sort of like, I feel a bit bad about how I treated David Shearer, and Duncan Garner said something like, David Shearer was a good bloke. There's something about him that people just liked, people just warmed to. But we in the media, we went for his weakest spots. And it's actually really interesting. Anyway, so that's total side note, But it is very important if you can get a good leader-deputy dynamic. And Luxon and Willis, the way that they're working together, certainly suggests that this is the best combination they've had since Key and English.
Yeah. Annabelle's back. If you've forgotten her phone, she's not happy. Her spectacles are all fogged up because of her mask, and she hasn't breathed for several hours. The donation stuff, let's just touch on that briefly before we leave. Because to be honest, most people have turned the podcast off. They're only here for Annabelle. Donations. There is a case underway at the moment over donations to National and Labour. But immediately before that, there was a case relating to donations to the New Zealand First Foundation.
Where two persons unknown.
Whose names permanently suppressed.
Were prosecuted, and the outcome of this case was basically gutted the electoral finance laws of New Zealand and essentially said that while it's very important for the party secretary and the party organisation, the National Party, the Labour Party, the New Zealand First Party, to keep strict and accurate records and declare all of the donations that they get for, helping this political party and spending on them, and any kind of chicanery or failing to declare or declaring the wrong amount or not declaring on time, that's a big problem for you and you'll be in trouble and, possibly even criminal charges. But if you just set up an organisation to one side with similar sounding name, like the New Zealand First Foundation rather than the New Zealand First Party, it can receive as much money as it likes, which it can spend on the party and its candidates and its campaigning, and it doesn't matter, and it doesn't have to be declared. It's an absolute bullshit fucking rule.
Ben Thomas, standing for the International Affairs Officer, set up, there were rules, let's just say, about how much could be donated.
I think you could spend some $20
If you'd set up the Ben Thomas Foundation, and then a whole lot of people had donated a whole lot of money to that, and then the Ben Thomas Foundation had in turn donated money to Ben Thomas's campaign for International Affairs Officer. That's the kind of workaround, loophole, call it what you will, that was seen to be in play in that trial, right?
Yeah.
And Kiri Allen, who's recently became the Minister for Justice, has announced that there was already some legislation that was going through, which was going to reduce the threshold over which you needed to name from 15,000 to 5,000. Sort of, there are some other details around there, but that's the essence of it. She's now said that they will include in that another amendment which addresses what the definition of what a party donation is.
Yeah.
And that seems, I don't think anyone can reasonably argue with that, can they?
I mean, it's got to be closed up. It makes a mockery of all the law. This is actually the second time with the same party or the same also entities associated with the same party. You know, we saw this in 2008. Brian Henry, Winston Peters' personal lawyer, received, I think, $20,000 to $50,000 from Owen Glenn, who was a rich donor, and that was paying for Peters' legal fees. And, you know, that was the argument. It doesn't have to be declared because it's not doesn't have to be declared because it's not a donation to the party. It was just used for Winston Peters' personal legal fees. There's big wrangling about that. Ultimately, there was a privileges hearing into whether Peters had personally declared it in his register of pecuniary interests. But you get into these sort of side tangles and trails. You know, at the very least, you'd hope that there was some sort of privileges issue that arose out of this failed court case. But, you know, this just has to be stopped. You know, it's not even a loophole. It's just a door. It's just a doorway through with an arrow and dollar signs.
It's a giant bejeweled gazebo.
It's not so much a loophole as a giant fucking roller coaster that costs $15,000 to get on. And you know,
the other thing, which point that Max Rashbrook made. He's done some really good work on this. So is Graham Edgeler, who's wrote a good piece for the Spin-Off on this issue.
Yeah, very good piece by Graham.
He said that the other thing that needs to be put in there is a general anti-collusion provision, basically a vibe rule, which is to say that if the vibe is you're donating money to a political party, then you need to go along with that vibe. That would be nice to see.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, we see this tax law is the same as this, you know, in terms of tax avoidance. You know, you can, tax law is the same. It's a vibe check in a lot of cases, and case law develops around it. But you've got to have these kind of catch-all provisions, because the thing is, we do know this when we look at it. The judge knew it when he looked at it, and he just decided that, you know, on the technical reading of the words, somehow this escapes. And I mean, look, my only dreams in life are my only political dreams in life are the abolition of local government, and to see every member of New Zealand First led out of Parliament in leg irons to a prison. And, you know, we just have to keep on dreaming.
Well, I would like to conclude this podcast then with Winston Peters' response to this, in which he defended strongly and rejected all of Ben Thomas's nonsense, his vitriol, and he quoted Michael Cullen. Did you see that at the end of his press release this week? He quoted Michael Cullen's words in Parliament at some point in the past, in which Cullen said, "We won, you lost, eat that." And so
I think he also said the only victim here were democracy and the people of New Zealand, and I think I agree with him on that.
Well, there we go. Many thanks to Spin-Off members. Thanks to Ben Thomas. Thanks to Jane Yee. Thanks to Annabelle Lee Mather, who is currently tearing down the hills of Morningside. We will be back before you know it. Ka kite anō.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spin-Off. You can help us keep all of The Spin-Off's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.